Hello, and warm welcome to Holy Trinity Church in Maisons-Laffitte. Today is the second Sunday of Epiphany, and our two focus readings for today come from 1 Samuel 3, 1-20, and John 1, 43 to the end. If I were to say to you, phone, would you picture a device like this? Or maybe one more like this? It's kind of a generational question, especially if I say, does this one make you panic slightly? So because of my age, I'm not particularly bothered by this one, but my daughter had an incident this week, which I'm allowed to share, where the gorgeous French macaroons that she wanted to buy as a gift could only be obtained in time by making a direct phone call to a lovely little artisanal producer. So after some momentary horror on her part that this might be necessary, she plucked up the courage and did it. But we had a fascinating conversation afterwards about how weird it was for her generation. In fact, recent research out of Australia and the UK show that calling strangers produces anxiety for more than half of young people, which I suppose we could understand. I mean, they say they prefer text because they're more private, it allows them to have more control, and they definitely prefer video to voice calls because they can read the body language. I kind of relate to this. A cold voice call to or from an unknown person is scary. Makes sense. These kinds of calls are interruptions. Somebody's in the midst of doing something, and then there's this insistent, ringing, demanding, immediate, interact with me sort of sound. But if I'm receiving the call, I don't want to be interrupted. Unless, of course, it's someone important. If it's a message that's urgent, would I want to risk missing it? In today's two readings, Samuel, Philip, and Nathaniel's lives were interrupted by an unexpected call at an unexpected time, right? Young Samuel was in bed when God called. We don't know where Philip was, and Nathaniel was sitting under a fig tree, which is commonly understood to mean that he was some sort of scholar or sage. He was reading, meditating. Possibly his wisdom was being sought by the townspeople who knew that he was available there. Interruptions. How do you respond if you're interrupted? Annoyance? Feeling offended? Or curious? Or perhaps nervous that it might be an emergency? I realize that this is now my first reaction when the phone rings without warning, and I think, what's wrong? But our responses to interruptions of all sorts are very cultural and situational. Whether I respond with annoyance, curiosity, or apprehension may also depend on the time of day, my age, or even my general status in the greater scheme of society. And especially may depend on whether I'm hoping to hear from someone. Are you hoping to hear from God about something? I mean, he's already told us loads of stuff about his general will in the Bible. But sometimes we're hoping to get a direct, specific message from him about something really important in our private lives. You know what I mean? In the two texts today, we see three different calls from God and three responses. The Old Testament story is the child Samuel, maybe a teenager, and his response is to jump up and be ready to serve. Here I am, he says 3 times, to the wrong person, but that's what he says. The second is Philip. Jesus seeks him, says, "Follow me." Philip does. And then there's Nathaniel, older, educated, established. His friend Philip comes to him with unexpected news. "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." I think maybe Philip is trying to speak Nathaniel's language to him, speaking in terms of the Jewish scriptures. But Philip's response is dismissive. Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Maybe this was informed by Nathaniel's knowledge that the Messiah was to come from Bethlehem, or his lack of knowledge that Jesus had been born there. Perhaps perhaps it was also because Nazareth was seen as a kind of low-income backwater. Maybe there was some local cultural prejudice, oh, you come from that place. Either way, Philip shows a huge amount of wisdom, and he doesn't try to argue with Nathanael to convince him. He just says, come and see. 3 calls, 3 responses. And each of these responses has 2 parts. The first part is, who is calling me? And the second part is, what do I think? What do I do when I think it's God? And we'll see that actually for 2 of these, there's a kind of intermediary person helping the person being called to figure things out. It's kind of like looking at the number on our phone and talking to a person sitting next to us while we've got the phone on speaker. First I'm deciding and chatting to my friend, I don't recognize this number. I don't really want to talk to that person right now. Do you think I should answer? And the second one is when, we let the other person hear and we're kind of hearing what the person's saying on the phone and going, do I say yes or no? Samuel has no idea who's calling him. Eventually, it's Eli who explains to him he's hearing from God. Somebody else said, hey, that's God you're hearing from. Philip seems to recognize Jesus right away. He does have him standing in front of him. Nathanael is cautious. Maybe it's due to his erudition. Perhaps he has a cautious nature, or maybe he's just learned from bitter experience. But he is willing to go and see, which is sometimes all God is looking for. Will you just take the smallest next step? And then Jesus gives Nathanael a supernatural helping hand. Isn't it interesting that Jesus didn't give him a factual explanation of where he was born and how that fulfilled Scripture? Jesus gave him an answer that was intensely personal, and it cut right through to his heart. He even gave him a promise and even an invitation to grow, to imagine a time in the future when he could have even more spiritual insights. I wonder if one of the ways that we recognize God's call isn't also by what he's calling us to. This is important, and it is a lifelong spiritual exercise of developing discernment. Why is this so important? Well, I'll be slightly absurd. If I think I'm hearing voices which tell me to graffiti hate messages on the car of a person who's annoyed me at the grocery store, is this voice likely to be from God? Not really, right? How do I know? Well, I have some kind of tests about whether doing that would be consistent with God's character, things he's explicitly written down, like the 10 Commandments or the Great Commission. Because God doesn't change from one day to the next or one millennium to the next, then I need to take that into account. That's my first measure. There are also internal tests, internal hurdles. In these 3 examples, we have God calling each person to things consistent with his character, made wonderfully personal for the individual, but it still could have failed. Samuel's called to speak truth into a specific situation, but at first he was scared to tell Eli the message. Fear is a huge barrier. Philip was called to follow in person, and he gives us an example of being so excited about meeting God that he spontaneously shares, but he could have held on to it for himself, kind of felt smug relative to his clever friend. And Nathanael, he's got this first called, he comes and sees, but he could have gotten stuck behind his skeptical cognitive self. It's okay in theory, but I'm not moving out from beneath this fig tree I've always sat under. And anyway, I'm hardly going to tell Philip that he was right. But all of them did respond in ways which can serve as positive examples for us. In the first one, Samuel says to God, "Speak, for your servant is listening." And then he does what he's told, even though he has to be brave. So listening and obeying. In the second one, Philip immediately follows Jesus and generously, lovingly runs to share it with his good friend. So following Jesus and sharing. And in the third one, Nathanael doesn't stay sitting in his prejudice. He gets up. He goes to check out this new person. And when he's convinced, he's not held back by pride, but does a complete about-face and says, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." And that's really our ultimate response, isn't it? Repenting and worshiping. So as we go into the next week, thinking about recognizing Jesus and answering his call, maybe we can remember that the first step is to discern when an interrupting voice is calling me in a direction consistent with what I know to be true about God. And secondly, if it is God calling, then to think really carefully, what is he asking me to do? Is it listen and obey? Is it to be generous and loving with my friends? Or is it maybe to abandon my pride and turn to worship the Son of God in a new way? If one of these examples is speaking you today, let me encourage you to take a moment to sit quietly with God after this video has ended.